white men encounter a persistent and convergent opposition from non-white groups rooted in fundamental differences in group strategies and orientations. Non-white populations often operate with varying degrees of collectivism that direct efforts toward acquiring resources, status, and territory held by white societies. This opposition manifests through demographic pressures, political mobilization, and direct extraction, whether in the form of crime or policy-driven redistribution. White societies, built through generations of innovation, institutional development, and cultural continuity, attract these pressures precisely because of their achieved prosperity and stability. The asymmetry arises because white individualism and universalism leave little room for coordinated defense, while non-white particularism enables focused advancement at the expense of white continuity. The threat operates both overtly and covertly across multicultural environments. Non-white groups perceive white achievements as targets for acquisition rather than models for emulation, leading to patterns of encroachment on cities, regions, and nations originally developed by white populations. This process unfolds in real time, with friendships or individual relationships failing to alter underlying group dynamics that surface under conditions of resource competition or demographic shift. White men who engage in misplaced protection of non-white groups overlook how such actions redirect energy away from safeguarding their own families, children, and future generations. The result is a progressive erosion of safety, tranquility, and economic quality of life within white spaces. Addressing this reality requires open recognition that short-term capitalistic or personal gains cannot sustain white prosperity when long-term displacement occurs. White societies thrive when barriers maintain cultural and demographic integrity, allowing internal competition to elevate standards rather than undermine them through external alliances. The accumulation of these pressures demonstrates deliberate agendas by non-white entities to leverage white laws, openness, and morality against white interests. Without resolute action grounded in long-term foresight, the civilizational attributes of innovation, trust, and order face replacement by lower trust patterns that diminish overall human flourishing within affected territories. The asymmetry of group strategies. Non-white opposition to white men stems from innate and cultural divergences that favor particularist approaches over universal ones. Non-white groups exhibit stronger in-group preferences and collectivist tendencies that converge on advancing their interests against white majorities or creators. This produces one-way dynamics where envy and resource pursuit target white-built environments without reciprocal universalism. White men, operating from individualism and competition among themselves, often fail to register this collective thrust as a coordinated threat, interpreting it instead through lenses of personal opportunity or moral extension. Honor variants further distinguish these strategies. White and some Asian cultures emphasize honor as an internal virtue tied to consistency and self-restraint, whereas many other groups prioritize external reputation, deception, or immediate acquisition. This leads to patterns where non-white actors employ backstabbing, lies, or exploitation in interactions with white systems. The hordes of outsiders, lacking the cultural properties of modern white societies, default to attack and takeover rather than internal development. Such extractive behaviors target white cities and institutions as sites of unearned gain, accelerating under conditions of open access. These differences become pronounced in multicultural settings where personal relationships coexist with group-level realities. Friendships do not erase historical or racial factors that activate during scarcity or power shifts. Non-white agendas explicitly aim at acquiring white prosperity through invasion, policy, or violence, using white mentality of fairness against its originators. White men must therefore treat these patterns as structural threats requiring active countermeasures, rather than temporary frictions to be ignored. White vulnerabilities: altruism, short-sightedness, and performative behavior. White men display pronounced tendencies toward altruism and universalism that operate at the expense of their own group continuity. This manifests as self-sacrificial defense of non-white minorities, even in contexts lacking genuine threat, driven by conditioned moral supremacy and performative benevolence. Such actions project hostility toward other white men who reject the delusion, redirecting protective instincts outward while neglecting white children and families. The short-sighted mindset prioritizes immediate results over generational stability, rooted in capitalist competition and religious or secular grandiose morality. This vulnerability compounds through an internal taboo that renders open discussion of group realities feel unnatural or emotional. White men equate realism with vulnerability or fear, preferring vague generalities or short-term gains. Performative altruism, amplified by female influences within white communities, creates aggressive signaling against fellow whites. The result is a delusional application of honor and justice where non-white opposition receives defense despite evident convergent hostility. White innovation and civilization suffer diversion as energy expends on managing subversion instead of advancing internal excellence. Short-sighted capitalistic inclinations exacerbate these patterns. White men leverage non-white labor or alliances for immediate edges against rival whites, undercutting wages and social cohesion. Although competition remains inherent to male nature, its redirection toward external groups produces collective disadvantage. In abundant Western environments, this evolves into self-sabotage where personal profit diminishes the shared high-trust foundation essential for sustained prosperity. Long-term prospects diminish as displacement renders individual gains untenable. Patterns of displacement and takeover. Historical and contemporary examples illustrate the consequences of unaddressed opposition and white self-undermining. In South Africa, white populations built a functional modern state and then voted through altruistic reforms to relinquish power, enabling ANC dominance. This led to widespread devastation, farm attacks involving torture and murder targeting white creators, and emigration of those who facilitated the transition. The self-detrimental vote handed control to opposition forces, resulting in attacks on the very white communities that engineered the handover. American cities demonstrate parallel urban transformations. White flight from areas experiencing non-white influx produced declining prosperity, crime spikes, and loss of tax bases in places once exemplifying white achievement. States and regions shifted through immigration and differential fertility, relegating white populations to minority status with attendant policy changes favoring redistribution. European towns and cities followed similar trajectories as non-Western migration created no-go areas, parallel societies, and native displacement. Voting patterns enabled non-white office holders who further entrenched shifts against original populations. These takeovers reveal consistent mechanics. White short-sightedness and benevolence lower barriers, non-white collectivism exploits the opening, and creators become second-class or displaced within their own territories. The patterns extend to subjugation or forced relocation when white majorities erode. White women exert notable influence through empathy-driven policy preferences, with white men catering for relational, reproductive, and status benefits. This internal dynamic accelerates external pressures across geographic scales. Intra-white competition, gender influences, and ulterior motives. Competition among white men forms the foundation for many self-undermining alliances with non-whites. Economic and political motives drive the employment of cheap labor, formation of voting coalitions, or performative support that undercuts rival whites. Surface-level moral language masks financial, power, and ego incentives, producing short-term advantages at collective long-term cost. This intragroup rivalry, healthy when bounded internally, becomes destructive when it imports external opposition for immediate gain. White women amplify these tendencies through higher average support for universalist and compassion-oriented policies. Their influence in government, education, and social spheres shapes frameworks that prioritize outgroup aid. White men accommodate these positions to maintain pair bonds, family stability, and social standing, redirecting protective instincts in ways that favor non-white groups. The resulting gender dynamic within white communities tilts majorities toward short-term benevolence over long-horizon defense. Even mixed individuals hold stakes in preserving white cultural outputs. Innovation, societal norms, and orderly institutions benefit all who participate in or inherit from white spaces. Supporting whiteness sustains the environment that rewards competence and foresight, preventing replacement by substandard patterns of criminality and subsistence. Short-term competition persists, but requires bounding by awareness that white minority status nullifies gains through displacement and system collapse. The imperative for realism, redirection, and barriers. White men must redirect competition toward improving quality of life, defending children, and strengthening white culture within defined boundaries. This shift counters multiculturalism's frictions by establishing policy parameters that block non-white intrusion and cultural clash. Long-term prosperity, safety, and tranquility rise when internal rivalry focuses on excellence rather than external leveraging. Barriers preserve the civilizational attributes that enable white advancement and broader benefits. Communication and policy implementation can overcome the difficulty of addressing these realities. Open acknowledgement of threats from non-white groups and countries breaks obfuscation, allowing paradigms that prioritize white continuity. Short-sighted actors remain but face higher costs when collective foresight becomes normative. White action orientation, once freed from taboo, excels at pragmatic implementation of measures securing generational inheritance. The environment of whiteness, when protected, distributes its innovations and norms among white populations for mutual elevation. Intermixing and invasion impose excessive problems that multiculturalism cannot resolve. All parties, including those of partial white ancestry, gain from sustaining the source culture against devolution. This realism transforms short-term competition into sustainable advancement bounded by demographic and cultural integrity. Conclusion: the structural opposition from non-white groups demands recognition as a fundamental reality shaping white prospects in multicultural contexts. White vulnerabilities in altruism, short-sightedness, and internal competition have enabled patterns of displacement and extraction across history and geography. Redirecting energies toward defense of white children, cities, and culture within protected boundaries offers the pathway to restored prosperity and tranquility. Long-term foresight must supersede immediate gains if white societies are to maintain the attributes that define their achievement. Sustained communication and resolute policy grounded in group realism provide the means to secure continuity against convergent pressures. This orientation preserves not only white inheritance, but the civilizational standards that elevate human capacity wherever they endure.